In old age, as in every phase of life, a person is eventually confronted with a question that cannot be postponed any longer. A question not about success or failure, not about what was achieved or lost, but about being itself. How does one preserve self-awareness when relationships begin to thin, when familiar roles dissolve, and when the supports that once felt permanent quietly disappear? This question does not arise by accident. It emerges slowly, almost imperceptibly, when time reveals its unstoppable force, and those who once seemed irreplaceable begin to fade from daily life. What makes this moment unsettling is not the absence of others, but the sudden presence of oneself. And the silence that follows the retreat of external noise exposes something many people have avoided for decades: the inner foundation on which their life truly stands. Old age does not strip meaning away, it simply removes illusions. And in that removal, truth becomes unavoidable. It is here that the philosophy of Immanuel Kant stops being theoretical and becomes deeply personal. Kant did not speak of freedom as comfort or pleasure. He spoke of freedom as inner sovereignty. To him, a human being must be a law unto themselves, not a servant to circumstances, habits, or the expectations of others. In youth, this idea feels distant. Life appears full, noisy, crowded with obligations and relationships that seem to define who we are. We confuse connection with identity, approval with worth, presence with meaning. But time quietly dismantles this confusion. As years pass, children leave, friendships loosen, careers lose relevance, and even long-term partners may become distant or unfamiliar. What once felt like solid ground reveals itself as temporary support. Kant understood this inevitability. He saw old age not as decline, but as a moral test. Can a person remain inwardly connected to themselves when external validation fades? This is why Kant insisted that the only support one can truly rely on is inner moral strength. Everything else is contingent. Everything else can vanish. Old age teaches this lesson not cruelly, but honestly. It shows which bonds were real and which were merely functional, which values were internalized and which were borrowed. And in this realization leads to the first essential pillar of a meaningful old age: the ability to be alone without turning solitude into suffering. Kant never equated being alone with isolation. On the contrary, he viewed solitude as the space in which inner freedom becomes possible. A person who cannot endure their own presence becomes dependent on others for stability, identity, and reassurance. When those others are no longer there, life feels hollow, chaotic, and frightening. Not because life has lost meaning, but because meaning was never cultivated internally. To be alone in Kant's sense is not to reject relationships, but to release oneself from their deceptive centrality. It is to recognize that no external presence can substitute for an inner anchor. A person who learns to live within themselves is no longer at the mercy of absence. Consider an elderly woman living alone in a small, quiet apartment. Each evening, she sits by the window with a book and a cup of tea. She is not escaping loneliness. She is inhabiting her life. There is no rush to fill the silence, no desperate search for distraction. In that stillness, she feels whole. Kant would call this freedom. Not freedom from others, but freedom from dependence. When one is at peace with oneself, solitude becomes spacious rather than oppressive. The fear of being alone dissolves, replaced by a calm awareness that presence does not require an audience. Those who reach this state do not experience solitude as loss, but as clarity. From this inner clarity arises the second pillar: order in daily life. Kant believed that freedom cannot exist without order. not order imposed from outside, but order consciously chosen. Especially in old age, when external structures weaken, daily order becomes the framework that sustains inner stability. This order is not merely about cleanliness or routine. It is about alignment. When a person brings structure to their surroundings, they also bring structure to their mind. Disorder breeds restlessness. Accumulation anchors one to the past. Kant warned that attachment frozen in objects becomes a burden that obstructs inner movement. Imagine someone living among decades of unused possessions, broken items, and memories they no longer live, but refuse to release. In such a space, the past dominates the present. Energy is scattered. Freedom shrinks. Kant believed that purity, not moral perfection, but simplicity, is a condition for autonomy. To let go is not to erase history, but to reclaim attention. Those who cannot bring order to their daily life struggle to develop inner freedom. Chaos outside feeds chaos within. In old age, when time no longer offers endless chances to reorganize life, clarity becomes essential. Order becomes an act of self-respect. Yet even solitude and order are insufficient without the third pillar, indifference to the judgment of others. Kant argued that true freedom requires independence from opinion. To live according to one's inner law means accepting that others may misunderstand, criticize, or dismiss you. As people grow older, they often discover that their lives no longer align with social expectations. They may move slower, speak differently, value quieter things. Those still trapped in external validation feel diminished by this shift, but those who release the need for approval gain something far more powerful: integrity. Kant believed that opinions of others are reflections of their own fears, not measures of your worth. To constantly justify oneself is to surrender autonomy. The deepest respect arises not from being admired, but from being at peace with oneself. And this leads to the final and most profound foundation: fidelity to oneself. The quiet, unshakable sense that one's life still matters, not because someone depends on it, but because it is lived consciously. For Kant, meaning never came from recognition, praise, or productivity. It came from the inner awareness that each day is lived in accordance with one's values. An elderly woman who puts on lipstick each morning, not to be seen, but to honor herself. Someone who waters plants, stretches their body, writes thoughts in a notebook. These acts are not trivial. They are declarations of presence. When a person ceases to feel valuable to themselves, life becomes empty regardless of who remains around them. But when meaning arises from within, old age transforms. It becomes not an ending, but a refinement. Old age, then, is not the loss of freedom. It is the moment freedom is finally tested. Not freedom from constraints, but freedom to live according to one's own law. Those who strengthen these inner pillars discover that even as the world grows quieter, their inner life grows stronger. And this is where the deepest misunderstanding about aging must be corrected. Old age is not a season meant to be endured, nor a waiting room before disappearance. It is a narrowing of life that forces concentration. When distractions fall away, what remains is essence. Kant understood this with striking clarity. He believed that a human being reaches their most authentic form, not when they are surrounded by possibilities, but when they are confronted with limits. Limits reveal character. In earlier years, it is easy to mistake motion for meaning. Life moves quickly, filled with tasks, ambitions, and expectations. One rarely pauses long enough to ask whether these movements arise from inner conviction or external pressure. Old age slows the body, but in doing so, it sharpens awareness. It asks a single, an uncompromising question. Are you living according to your own law? Or have you spent your life obeying invisible commands issued by others? This is why fidelity to oneself becomes the final measure of freedom. Kant did not define a meaningful life by usefulness to others, but by loyalty to one's own moral consciousness. When external roles disappear, this loyalty is all that remains, and it is enough. Consider how many people reach old age feeling strangely irrelevant, not because they lack value, but because they tied their worth to functions that no longer apply. Careers end. Children grow independent. Social recognition fades. If meaning was borrowed from these roles, it collapses with them. But if meaning was cultivated internally, nothing essential is lost. And a person who wakes up each morning with a quiet sense of purpose does not ask whether they are needed. They ask whether they are present. Presence, for Kant, is the highest form of dignity. It is the act of choosing oneself daily, even when no one is watching. This is why small rituals carry immense weight in later life. Making coffee slowly, opening a book, tending to a plant, writing a few lines by hand. These acts are not habits of distraction, but gestures of self-recognition. They say, I am still here. This day still matters. Kant believed that meaning does not come from intensity, but from consistency. A life aligned with inner principles does not need applause. It carries its own gravity. This is the freedom that grows stronger as external power fades. Well, then here lies the paradox few acknowledge. Aging can be the most liberating phase of life. When the pressure to prove dissolves, authenticity becomes possible. When expectations lose their grip, clarity emerges. The elderly person who no longer seeks approval often possesses a calm authority that youth cannot imitate. This authority does not shout. It does not persuade. It simply exists. Such a person has learned indifference, not as coldness, but as discernment. They know which voices matter and which do not. They no longer negotiate their identity with every opinion they encounter. Kant would say they have withdrawn sovereignty from the crowd and returned it to the self. This does not mean disengaging from the world. It means engaging on one's own terms. A person grounded in inner law can still love, still care, and still contribute, but without fear of loss defining their actions. Relationships become choice rather than necessity. Presence becomes gift rather than demand. Old age, then, becomes a space of refinement. Superfluous desires fall away. Performative identities dissolve. What remains is a distilled self, quieter, slower, but more real. Kant warned that those who fail to cultivate this inner foundation risk experiencing old age as emptiness, not because life lacks content, but because chaos fills the absence of inner order. When one has never learned to be alone, solitude feels unbearable. When one has never acted independently of opinion, judgment feels crushing. When one has never honored oneself, existence feels insignificant. But the opposite is equally true. Those who strengthen these inner pillars discover a freedom that no external loss can erase. Their days may be simpler, but they are not smaller. Their world may be quieter, but it is not empty. This is the true power of aging. It reveals that freedom was never granted by circumstance. It was always a capacity waiting to be claimed. Kant said that freedom is not the absence of constraints, but the ability to act according to one's own laws. Old age strips away excuses. It asks whether those laws exist within you, or whether your life has been governed entirely by forces outside your control. When you can answer that question honestly, something profound shifts. Aging stops feeling like decline and begins to feel like alignment. The self you carried beneath layers of obligation finally steps forward. Old age, then, is not an ending. It is a return to the essential relationship, the one you have with yourself. And for those willing to accept this challenge, it becomes not a period of loss, but of quiet triumph. Because when everything external grows uncertain, the person who has learned to be a law unto themselves remains unshaken. And that, Kant would remind us, is the highest form of human freedom.